Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation's LNTV. I'm Mark Angelides. Joining me now is one of America's most widely syndicated columnists, Cal Thomas, a prolific author. Cal has written, I believe it's a dozen books now, with his latest being America's Expiration Date, The Fall of Empires and Superpowers, and the Future of the United States. Thank you for joining us here, Cal. Much appreciated.
Well, I'm happy to be with you, and thanks for reading my book. I've been looking for the one reader for years.
Not true. I've seen the Amazon has plenty of reviews on there. So,
well, you know, I'm from Washington, D.C., and if you can fake humility, you can fake anything.
Absolutely. So, Cal, you write fairly regularly on issues to do with American media, and more specifically, an article you wrote on free speech recently. It seems to me that as well as decrying the wholesale censorship of conservatives, one of the key aspects that maybe prompted you to write this recent piece was the double standards being applied. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Well, as a friend of mine says, if the left didn't have double standards, they'd have no standards at all. I looked at the coverage of the Biden inauguration on January 20th and found it to be so over the top. It was just hilarious. Just a few examples. A woman who was the editor at the New York Times tweeted, Biden landing at Joint Base Andrews now. I have chills. CNN political director David Chalian, those lights that are just shooting out from the Lincoln Memorial along the reflecting pool, it's almost extensions of Joe Biden's arms embracing America. And then Major Garrett of CBS News, who I knew when we both worked at Fox, compared Biden's inaugural address to that of a priest. He said the beginning had a soaring rhetoric, a tiny bit at the end. The middle, it sounded like a homily. But like a priest explaining something from the Bible or something, I'm breaking it down for you so we can all have a common language and a common understanding. And I wrote at the end, please pass the communion wafer. I mean, this is so over the top. So much of the media have become propagandistic for the worldview that they universally share. It's an embarrassment from the time I started out in journalism as a 18-year-old copy boy at the NBC News Bureau in Washington, with really, really great journalists, people who came from newspapers or wire services to this new broadcast news operation. Many of them are hanging on my wall. They're pictures now. They're a reminder of what real journalism looked like. But so many people have now worked for Democrats. They've worked in the Democratic Party. They are Democrats, and they see the world through the prism of their own worldview and don't believe that anyone else has anything worthy of consideration. Just one example, Chuck Todd, who hosts NBC's Meet the Press, said a year or so ago he would never have a guest on who didn't believe in climate change because he said the science was settled. Well, science is never really settled. I mean, in the 1970s, Newsweek magazine had a cover story on the coming ice age, and all the scientists agreed. Well, they were wrong. So I think stifling debate and censoring points of view that you may not believe in is really not what journalism is supposed to be.
It certainly does seem to be the order of the day, though. It's not just refusing to host people, for example, who perhaps don't have the agreed upon definition of climate change, of where it comes from, who causes it. But it's almost as though the media's job now is more sort of a gatekeeper, as in they've got to stop other people using their own platforms to express their opinions.
Right, and we're seeing that now, of course, with Twitter and Facebook censoring people that the leadership think is promoting inaccurate information. Well, let the public decide that. I mean, the key to a democracy is freedom of thought. An old friend of mine who passed away a few years ago, Nat Hentoff, not only an expert in jazz, but also a fierce defender of the First Amendment and a member of the American Civil Liberties Union. He famously said, and I've quoted him in a column, the answer to speech you don't like is not less speech, it's more speech. And that is what characterizes a civilized and democratic society. Unless you are crying fire in a crowded theater when there is no fire, then just about any speech ought to be free and unencumbered. But more and more, we're seeing these people, these CEOs at Facebook and Twitter and others, not just censoring, but eliminating people from their social media platforms. That's not the kind of journalism I grew up with. And by the way, a lot of these people are contributors, big contributors to Democratic candidates.
Yes, they are. You mentioned a column just then that you wrote. I believe that was in the Town Hall column on whether modern media is more biased than before.
Yeah.
And as you just say, things have changed very much from when you started in the newsrooms at age 18. And you mentioned in that particular column about Eric Burns's book, The Infamous Scribblers.
Yeah.
For anybody who's not familiar with that, could you give us a short taste of the history here?
Yeah, Eric was a colleague at Fox News. He hosted a program I was on for 10 years. It was a media critique show, and quite a good one, if I do say so myself. He looked back at colonial journalism at the founding of our country, and found that a lot of scandalous stuff was reported, put on the front page of newspapers, no fact checkers, things that would be libelous or even seditious today were printed. So the press hasn't really changed all that much. I wrote in the column in 1920, in America, we had a president just elected named Warren Harding, who the media just fell in love with. He died in 1923, and then out came the Teapot Dome scandal and news that he had a affair with another woman, not his wife, and all of a sudden his pristine, his virginal political image was destroyed. So I think the media, especially journalism, have an obligation to search for the truth and report it fairly and accurately. And if there's another responsible point of view, to report that as well. But you look at average newspapers, New York Times, Washington Post, especially today, and you compare it with a conservative newspaper like the Washington Times, it's like night and day. As a friend of mine says, the greatest power the media have is the power to ignore. So not only do you slant what you claim to be news with your own points of view and your own biases, you ignore other stories that counteract or correct those points of views. And I think that's very dangerous in a free society.
What you say about the power to ignore stories, it's quite fitting. We're recording on January 27th here. And this morning, one of the big stories was of Tulsi Gabbard, who recently left office as representative for Hawaii. And she made a video and a plea to Joe Biden, asking him to curtail what she called domestic enemies, who are John Brennan, Adam Schiff, who are rescinding the rights in the names of protecting Americans. And this is a big story. This is a former Democrat congresswoman, and it didn't have a single mention on any of the alphabet soup websites. It was just completely ignored.
Right. Well, she also ran for president. She was up there on the debate stage during the campaign and was a credible. But this gets to the point, Mark, of what I'm saying. If you don't buy in to the reigning doctrine of secular progressivism, even if you were on the other side at one time, if you converted to the other side, then you are no longer credible. You take a look at people who used to be pro-choice on abortion and have come across to the other side, and they're now pro-lifers for various reasons. While they were pro-choicers, they were credible sources. They were quoted in major newspapers. They were interviewed on networks. And as soon as they changed their mind and came over to the other side, all of a sudden they're persona non grata. They have nothing to say. They're not credible anymore. They're not interviewed and they're not quoted. And that's true of a number of situations, whether it be taxes, whether it be foreign policy, whatever it is. If you do not subscribe to the zeitgeist, the spirit of the journalistic and secular progressive age, you are to be sidelined, you are to be ignored, you are to be put down, you are to be censored.
You know, Cal, we've discussed the past and we've just discussed the present here. But what do you see coming from the Fourth Estate in the future? I mean, I've been trying to, for example, watch every single White House press with Jen Psaki, who I think is a very competent person. But the question started out about the color of Air Force One, the favorite ice creams, things like this. But now it seems to be more of for the actual press pool, it's starting to become more of an exercise in frustration with responses. I'll circle back to you on that. I'll circle back to you on that. Do you think the burgeoning volte-face comes from a genuine desire that they actually, the media, the fourth estate in that situation, they want to get to the news, or are they trying to rebuild credibility? How do you see it going in the future?
Well, first of all, the media are engaged in a massive cover-up and have been with Joe Biden. They allowed him to present himself as a moderate, as a devout Catholic, as somebody who is not as extreme as a Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, just a good old boy, good old lunch bucket Joe, who is part of the working man's community. Well, now if you've seen, if you've been paying attention, I know you have, the first 17, 18 executive orders are right out of the Bernie Sanders playbook. They're left-wing, climate change, racial equity, whatever that means. I mean, the Democrats for 50 years have spent money, have passed programs to supposedly equalize African Americans with everybody else. If it's still not working, then maybe we ought to try something else, like putting the African American family together in the first place, like keeping men in the home, like not fathering or mothering children at the age of 13 or 14, like not shooting up neighborhoods in Chicago where sometimes 24 or more people die on an average weekend. I mean, the answers to these things are obvious, but why would you put credibility in somebody like Joe Biden and other Democrats when they have failed so miserably? The media never raised these questions. The only reporter now at the White House who is actually challenging Jen Psaki and Biden is the one with Fox News. And they kind of laugh or smirk at him as if he is some kind of an outlier. Well, unfortunately, in today's media, Peter Doocy is an outlier because he actually asks questions designed to produce answers, not the ice cream question.
Yeah. Let's talk briefly about the new president's legislative agenda, if you may. So there's a lot of recent polling that suggests that many of these early actions that he's taken, which you say are more similar to what we'd expect of Bernie Sanders. They're either unpopular or have unintended consequences, according to the polling, specifically with regards to immigration and the Keystone Pipeline.
Right.
What are your thoughts on this? Do you think we'll see buyer's regret?
Well,
Biden's regret?
That's Biden's regret. Yeah. Well, the media have a lot of responsibility in this, Mark, because, as I said, they've aided in the cover-up of who Biden really is. Let's just take one example. For 40 years, Biden opposed, as a United States Senator, the federal funding of abortion. He supported what's known as the Hyde Amendment, which prohibited that and money going to foreign entities that performed abortion. Now, all of a sudden, during the 2020 campaign, he's all for it. And nobody asked him why. No reporter confronted him with, how could you hold what you said was a moral position in line with the teaching of your Catholic Church for 40 years and all of a sudden flip to the other side? Well, he said the other day that he doesn't want to impose his moral choices on everybody else. Well, you might as well have just a secular progressive and atheist in office in terms of public policy. If you know something to be right and true, why wouldn't you at least argue it? Never mind the legislation. Why wouldn't you argue it to convince people of the veracity of your position? So I don't know what the media are going to do. I do think, though, that we need to encourage more young people to go into the profession, because if we don't, we just leave a vacuum out there for all of these other people to come in and continue the biases and the left-wing secular progressivism that we're seeing now. Again, the media have a responsibility to report the truth, but the problem for them is they no longer believe that truth exists. It's feelings now, it's intentions. It's easy to be a liberal because you don't have to solve anything. You just feel good about what you've done. Well, that's not the kind of attitude I have. I want to solve things. I want to provide solutions. I want to improve the lives of everybody. And you feel good after the fact, not before.
It's a very postmodern outlook, isn't it? To say there's no such thing as a base truth, and of course, how can you solve problems if you don't have basic parameters with which you can agree upon?
That's right.
So, Cal, you have a new book out, America's Expiration Date: The Fall of Empires and Superpowers and the Future of the United States. Now, this is a topic that it fascinates me hugely. My podcast, The Rabbit Hole, it looks at legends and history, and it kind of applies those lessons to modern politics. Now, in the book, which I've ordered, by the way, I believe you've discussed how the superpowers of the last few hundred years, how they've ultimately failed. Can you give us a little insight into this?
Yeah, not only hundreds, but thousands. I mean, it's all about human nature. Human nature never changes, Mark. You can dress people up in a toga or a suit or a dress. You can have your mode of transportation be a camel or a donkey or a jet airplane or a train, but you take your human nature with you. There are certain similarities to all of these empires and superpowers that have collapsed. One of them is uncontrolled immigration without assimilation. We certainly see that happening in America right now, and in Europe for that matter. Number two, massive national debt. We have a $28 trillion debt in America. We don't have enough tax dollars to pay for it. Even if you taxed 100% of every millionaire and billionaire's income, it still wouldn't be enough. And Biden wants to spend more on this climate change nonsense. The third common denominator in the fall of these empires and superpowers is a loss of a shared moral sense. We talked a moment ago about nobody can define what truth is anymore, or right from wrong. Everything is okay as long as you feel good about it. So Biden lifts the restrictions on transgenders in the military, and he mandates that transgenders be allowed to use women's restrooms and locker rooms and participate in women's sports, which will destroy women's sports in America and their opportunities for scholarships and endorsements and all of these other things that women's sports have built up over the years. The feminists are saying nothing about this. It's amazing. But all of these things and more, as I write in the book, are common to the fall of empires and superpowers. And I fear, in the last chapters about the United States, I fear that we are on the same path. And if we don't turn it around quickly, there's no guarantee. Ronald Reagan used to say, we're only one generation away from losing it all.
Yeah, one generation away. Absolutely. Without giving the ending away of the book, because I hate spoilers, what steps would the United States need to take to avoid a similar fate to the empires and the superpowers of the past?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one I'm always asked in interviews. I think the first thing we'd have to do is reclaim our children and grandchildren. We've got to get them out of these re-education camps. Biden just assigned an executive order doing away with what's called the 1776 Project, an effort to teach real history of the United States in our public schools. Well, we have the 1619. Whatever. Yeah, whatever it is, the New York Times came up with, that says that everything, all history, must be viewed through the prism of slavery. The stain of slavery is America's original sin. It can never be removed. It's the scarlet letter. It's the mark of Cain. And so all history must be viewed through this prism. We got to get our kids out of these things. And, if you're going to have children, you got to take care of them. And I don't mean just as infants. You got to take care of their intellectual understanding, their moral depth, and all of these other things. So get them out of the public schools, either put them in private schools or homeschool them. And don't send them to universities that where professors left over from the 1960s unravel their faith, teach them about a history of the United States that is not true, blame their parents for climate change, and they come home from school at Thanksgiving or Christmas time as intellectual and moral zombies. I mean, we don't send our troops to an enemy power to train them. We train our own troops here. But we're willingly sending our children and grandchildren into these re-education camps where they're coming out as zombies. So if we're going to turn this around, it's got to start there.
Interesting points, Cal. I was actually just reminded when you were speaking there of a P.J. O'Rourke story of when he was young, and he went home from college and told his grandma, he says, "I'm a communist," and she says, "Well, at least you're not a Democrat."
Yeah, a great story. Yeah.
That is a fun one. Big fan of P.J. O'Rourke. Cal, one more question, if I may. A little more esoteric. So throughout history, there have been certain documents, the Bible certainly, the reimagined Magna Carta. They seem to have a longevity to them, perhaps because they appeal to the soul rather than self-interest. Would you say that the U.S. Constitution fits that theme? And do you see any major changes or interpretations of the Constitution in the future?
That's a great question. I think, the Declaration of Independence was the moral foundation of the Constitution. Without it, you've got, the French Revolution. And when Thomas Jefferson, though he was a deist, understood that certain human rights had to come from outside of the reaches of men and women, institutions in government. Otherwise, they could be taken away by those institutions. So that's why he wrote, all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And then among these are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But in the next clause, Jefferson outlined the purpose of government. He wrote, and to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. To secure what rights? Why, the rights that have been endowed. Why is that necessary? Because, as James Madison said, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government. But men are not angels. So we have to be controlled and constrained by a system operating, quote, under God, responsible to an authority higher than a president or ourselves, in order to promote the general welfare, provide for the common defense, and ensure domestic tranquility. All these things go together and were the foundation of our Constitution. But we are getting away from that now. We have judges who don't read the Constitution, who don't believe in it. Thanks to Trump, we have about 300 who do, but Biden and the Democrats want to name judges who don't. So this is the big conflict in America right now.
Cal Thomas, thank you ever so much for your time.
Mark, it's great. Love your work.
Thanks a lot. And thank you to you at home. That's it for this edition of Liberty Nation TV. Remember to hit Liberty Nation News for original articles, the Uprising and Rabbit Hole podcasts, and our signature television program, The Conservative 5. Just go to libertynation.com on your browser, or hit Rumble, YouTube, or check out our Liberty Nation News Roku channel. I'm Mark Angelides. Thanks for watching. This program is a production of libertynation.com. Conservative news, where truth matters.
Go deeper on the topic discussed in this video, head on over to one of these links here or go to our Liberty Nation Roku channel. Thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for Liberty.